Deep within the Indian Ocean, concealed beneath deposits of sand and coral that have accumulated over many generations, rests the wreck of a vessel. It was intended to bring immense riches to a single individual, but rather than enriching him, it led to his downfall. Now, visualize the chart. Beginning in London, draw a path southward over the Atlantic, skirting the Cape of Good Hope and heading into the immense desolation of the Indian Ocean. That expanse, close to 24,000 kilometers of ocean, was the designated patrol area for a single captain, William Kidd, in 1696. He received a newly built naval vessel, a royal warrant bearing the signature of King William III, and instructions that appeared straightforward. Capture pirates, confiscate their loot, transport everything to England, and prosperity would follow for all. Yet now draw an additional line on the chart, heading north from the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, and observe how the path abruptly ends. This was the location where the Adventure Galley, a vessel at the forefront of naval technology, languished and decayed in a shallow anchorage. Shipworms had riddled its hull, sailors were abandoning ship, and the captain found himself marooned far from England, thousands of kilometers away. He was burdened with pilfered goods and an accusation of murder. Influential figures back in London were already scheming to prevent him from ever revealing the truth in public. William Kidd never intended to turn pirate. His mission was to capture them. This is the tale of a well-regarded mariner who ultimately witnessed his own vessel going down. Those who dispatched him on this expedition later acted as though he were a stranger. It stands among the most shameful betrayals in the history of the seas. That narrative is recounted here. To grasp how William Kidd wound up trapped on a decaying vessel in a remote location, it is essential to know his background. In reality, prior to all these events, no one would have imagined him as a pirate. By the beginning of the 1690s, Kidd resided in New York City. His spouse was Sarah Bradley Cox-Ort, a lady who had lost 2 previous husbands before their marriage. She also possessed some of Manhattan's most prime property. Kidd owned real estate on Wall Street and belonged to New York's upper class. He worshipped at Trinity Church and shared meals with colonial governors. By all meaningful standards in late 1600s New York, William Kidd was an honorable and prosperous citizen. Furthermore, he had spent years as a lawful privateer in the Caribbean, battling the French in King William's War. Privateering was entirely lawful, with the Crown granting commissions in effect, permits. These allowed privately owned ship captains to engage hostile ships and retain a portion of whatever they seized. It was essentially sanctioned piracy, and Kidd excelled at it. Thus, when influential English aristocrats approached him in 1695 with an offer, there was no cause for Kidd to be wary. The arrangement was simple. England faced a threat from pirates. French and English corsairs were wreaking havoc on commercial lanes in the Indian Ocean, preying on vessels of the East India Company and the Mughal Empire. The monarchy desired a hunter to pursue them. Yet here the pact became intricate. It was not a publicly financed mission. Rather, the backers were private financiers, and not ordinary ones at that. Among the supporters were several of England's most influential politicians. One was the Earl of Bellamont, soon to assume the governorship of New York. Also involved were the Earl of Orford, holding the post of First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Baron of Romney, serving as Secretary of State. Additional backers bore surnames resembling a roster of the English nobility. This group insisted on keeping their participation secret. The agreement was arranged such that Kidd would undertake all the navigation, all the combat, and if necessary, all the dying. While this was happening, the backers remained in London to take their cut. Kidd's agreement entitled him to 1/10 of any loot, while the rest was to be shared amongst the financiers. Should Kidd come back empty-handed, he'd be personally liable for reimbursing the investors the entire expedition's expenses. On the surface, that was an awful contract. Yet Kidd accepted it all the same, since the agreement came with an intangible perk that no amount of money could procure. The document was a privateering charter bearing the personal signature of King William III. This gave Kidd the legal power to capture pirate ships and French enemy vessels across the globe. That charter was meant to act as his defense, to guard him from precisely the sort of danger he was heading towards. But it failed to do so. For this venture, they constructed a vessel named the Adventure Galley, a true marvel of 1690s engineering. Built at the Castle Yard in Deptford beside the Thames, she was a galley frigate of roughly 288 metric tons, carrying 34 cannons. Her distinctiveness came not from her cannons, though, but from her oars. The Adventure Galley carried 46 oars, arranged as 23 per side, that could be put into use whenever the breeze dropped. During that era, a becalmed vessel was a sitting duck, so this design gave Kidd a significant tactical benefit. He could run down any craft irrespective of wind conditions. With her speed and heavy weaponry, she was the perfect tool for the long-distance raiding expedition Kidd had been contracted to undertake. There was a single catch, however. The vessel was brand new, while the sailors were not. In April 1696, Kidd departed England with only some of the sailors he needed, heading for New York to find the remaining men. It was at this point that the plan began to fall apart. The top sailors, those seasoned privateers with real skill, were already taken. To speak plainly, the men Kidd managed to sign up in New York were the bottom of the barrel. This crew consisted of ex-pirates, deserters, and fellows with no stakes and no allegiance to anybody. Even worse, their deal stipulated that without captured prizes there would be no wages. They earned no regular pay. Payment came solely when Kidd seized something of worth. So from day one he commanded a crew of desperate individuals. If he turned up no loot, these penniless men would grow ever more furious, and for months on end he brought back nothing. After crossing the Atlantic, the Adventure Galley sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. By early 1697, Kidd was in the Indian Ocean, and right away every conceivable misfortune began to occur. To begin with, illness struck. While anchored off the Comoro Islands near Madagascar, cholera swept through the crew, killing 1 man in 3. Kidd had no choice but to remain there for weeks, burying the dead and attempting to find recruits among the locals. Then came the search itself. For months, Kidd scoured the familiar pirate hideouts and came up nearly empty. The pirates he'd been sent after had either vanished, were more heavily armed than him, or operated under the shelter of local chiefs. Those rulers had no desire to assist an English privateer. At the same time, the Adventure Galley herself began deteriorating, since tropical seas at the end of the 1600s were highly corrosive to wooden hulls. A saltwater clam species, Teredo navalis, generally called the shipworm, was drilling through the hull with terrifying speed. The underside of the Adventure Galley was being devoured. Water kept leaking inside, forcing the pumps to operate non-stop to prevent her from sinking. Consider the scene. Kidd was thousands of kilometers from home. His men were perishing, and his vessel was taking on water. So far he had seized nothing worthwhile, while in London his backers were awaiting a profit on their investment. The crew was becoming uneasy, no, worse than uneasy. They were teetering on the brink of mutiny. It was amid such desperation and intense pressure that William Kidd reached the choices that would permanently shape how history remembers him. By the middle of 1697, Kidd had spent more than 12 months at sea without a single success. No pirate loot, no seized French vessels, absolutely nothing, and with every plunder-free day, the crew became more dangerous by the hour. You have to comprehend what no prey, no pay truly meant on a vessel like this one. These individuals had left their entire lives behind and journeyed halfway across the planet. They had watched friends perish from cholera in the Comoros and spent months pumping water from a leaky hull in relentless tropical heat, and they had not received a single coin for their efforts. Now put yourself in Kidd's shoes. You're standing on the quarterdeck of a ship that's falling apart. You're commanding men who are brazenly discussing the idea of seizing control themselves. And then, in August 1697, a group of Mughal merchant ships appears on the horizon near the Indian coastline. Those vessels were neither pirate ships nor French ones. They belonged to the Mughal Empire, one of England's most crucial commercial partners. Attacking them would have been piracy, pure and simple. Kidd's crew, however, couldn't have cared less. They looked upon silk, spices, and gold drifting past, and they desperately wanted it. Kidd was under immense pressure to strike, and part of the crew even threatened open rebellion. Others merely cast him dark looks, the kind that warn a captain his authority is barely holding. Yet Kidd refused to attack the Mughal convoy. He stood his ground, but the harm had already been done. From then on, the crew saw him merely as a roadblock to the wealth they felt they deserved. The most outspoken of these men was a gunner by the name of William Moore, who had been pressuring Kidd for weeks. The crew wanted to abandon the privateer arrangement altogether and simply seize every ship they came across. The situation exploded on 30 October 1697. Moore was on deck sharpening a chisel when he made his feelings known once more, calling Kidd a worthless captain. Certain accounts say he accused Kidd of ruining them all and being too cowardly to act. The quarrel escalated, and Kidd, consumed by rage, grabbed a wooden, iron-banded bucket and slammed it into the side of Moore's skull. Moore hit the deck, never regained consciousness, and died the following day. Whether that was outright murder or a ship's master imposing order on a sailor who was actively provoking rebellion, the answer depends entirely on who you ask. In the 17th century, a captain's authority at sea was effectively absolute, and openly questioning it was understood to carry severe repercussions. However, the prosecution at Kidd's trial would ignore that context completely and paint the incident as premeditated murder. That bucket, that single burst of violence on a sweltering afternoon in the Indian Ocean, would stay with William Kidd all the way to the scaffold. But the true turning point arrived a few months later, in January 1698. The Adventure Galley intercepted an Armenian merchant ship of roughly 400 tons called the Quetta Merchant, and she was packed with satins, muslins, gold, silver, and opium. Her cargo was valued at between £200,000 and £400,000, a staggering sum for that era. Now comes the detail that would later redeem Kidd, or damn him, depending on whose story was being told. The Quetta Merchant was sailing with a French pass, a document from the French East India Company that guaranteed the vessel protection from French warships. Because England was at war with France, that French pass in theory made the Quetta Merchant a legitimate prize under Kidd's privateering commission. Kidd captured the vessel and held onto the passes as evidence of the capture's legality. He believed, sincerely believed, that everything he had done was exactly what his commission authorized. But the Quetta Merchant was not in fact a French ship. Her true owners were Armenian merchants, and part of her cargo belonged to a minister at the Mughal court. The seizure touched off an international crisis. The Mughal emperor was furious and threatened to bring all English trade in India to a halt. Because its whole commercial operation relied on the Mughals' favor, the East India Company insisted that the culprit be prosecuted without delay. All at once, the most influential figures in England found themselves needing someone to blame. When Kidd arrived at Madagascar in April 1698, the Adventure Galley was beyond saving. Shipworms had eaten through it. The hull was so badly damaged that sailors had to man the pumps day and night merely to stop the vessel from sinking. The timbers beneath the waterline were perforated with holes, and in spots the wood had turned soft and powdery. Joints that had been sealed and resealed were gaping open more quickly than they could be patched. Kidd moved all the worthwhile items, the Quetta Merchant's cargo, cannons, provisions, and any usable rigging over to the Quetta Merchant itself. The Adventure Galley was dismantled down to its frame. Next, he had the remnants of the vessel deliberately beached on the sandbanks of St. Mary's Island. This tiny island, situated off Madagascar's northeastern coastline, was a notorious pirate hideout. The Adventure Galley sank into the mud, its keel touching the seabed. Its masts remained upright above the surface, resembling the skeleton of a carcass. The vessel, originally designed to chase down pirates, was now decomposing in a pirate port. Conditions on land were equally dire. Almost 100 of Kidd's men abandoned him as soon as they landed on Madagascar. A large number went over to Robert Cufford, a notorious pirate captain who was coincidentally stationed at St. Mary's Island. They grabbed whatever they could carry from Kidd's cargo and departed. Kidd was left with scarcely enough men to crew the Quetta Merchant. He found himself thousands of kilometers from home, with his former vessel gradually being swallowed by the mud at his back. The crew members who stayed were faithful solely due to having no other options. Meanwhile, reports from vessels passing by delivered a chilling piece of intelligence. London had already branded him a pirate, and the political climate had been entirely transformed. The Tories were exploiting Kidd's expedition to strike at the Whig nobles who had quietly funded it. Those very individuals who had endorsed Kidd's commission and financed his vessel were now openly condemning him. They disavowed all involvement in the undertaking and branded him a scoundrel and an outlaw. Lord Belmont was among the main architects. As the mastermind behind the whole plan, he was now responsible for making Kidd face justice. If Kidd spoke out, he would be left with no alternative. Should Kidd produce the papers revealing precisely who had sanctioned the voyage and who would have gained financially, the political consequences would be devastating. Kidd absolutely had to be silenced, by whatever means necessary. Kidd chose to sail back to the Americas aboard the Quedagh merchant, intending to bargain his way out of his predicament. It was a desperate bet, yet Kidd remained convinced that he still had a trump card: the French passes. He firmly believed that showing the French passes taken from the Quedagh merchant to the authorities would demonstrate the legality of his captures. According to his commission's stipulations, he had adhered to the regulations and verified the paperwork, so the French passes rendered the confiscation lawful. From Kidd's perspective, presenting those documents to the appropriate individuals would resolve everything. However, he failed to realize that in London the French passes no longer mattered at all. The political arithmetic had shifted entirely. Lord Belmont and the other Whig noblemen simply could not risk being linked to Kidd's expedition. If the public learned that top government officials had personally bankrolled a privateer, now branded a pirate, the political destruction would be immense. Kidd was no longer a privateer who had seized an enemy ship. He had become a risk, a dangling thread that influential men had to snip before it pulled apart the whole fabric. The Quedagh merchant, under Kidd's command, journeyed across the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, traversed the Atlantic, and reached the Caribbean. This voyage spanned several months, during which he likely received reports from other vessels encountered en route. All the news was bad. He featured on wanted notices. England's authorities had publicly branded him a pirate, and warships had been sent out to track him down. He made a halt at Hispaniola, which today comprises the Dominican Republic and Haiti. There he abandoned the Quedagh merchant, entrusting its leftover cargo to a local trader called Henry Bolton, ostensibly for protection. His intention was to retrieve it after clearing his reputation, yet that moment never arrived. The Quedagh merchant, in due course, was set ablaze and scuttled where it lay anchored. Its wreckage wasn't definitively recognized until 2007. In 2007, a team of marine archaeologists from Indiana University located the remains in shallow seas near the Dominican Republic shore. But all of that was unknown to Kidd then. He procured a lesser, more discreet sloop named the Antonio and navigated northward along the American seaboard. En route to New York, he started handing out portions of his loot among several associates. Several caches were concealed on Gardiner's Island, near Long Island's easternmost point, and in other coastal spots. His aim was to build bargaining power. Should he be captured, the treasure's whereabouts would serve as his negotiation chip. That Gardiner's Island hoard represented his final remaining safeguard. Its subsequent inventory listed gold dust, silver ingots, rubies, diamonds, and various other valuable gems. Though impressive, the haul represented just a small portion of the Quedagh merchant's total load. The fate of the remainder has fueled treasure hunts and rampant conjecture for more than 3 centuries. Come July 1699, Kidd reached Boston, with the Earl of Bellomont already there. Ahead of his arrival, Kidd dispatched letters seeking assurances of safe conduct and an impartial tribunal. He still held on to the idea that, at this last hour, his words could extricate him. Once the relevant men heard his version and inspected the French passes, they would surely understand. Bellomont gave a soothing reply, urging Kidd, "Come inside. We can figure this out. Allow us to review your papers. You'll be given an impartial hearing." In reality, it was a trap. On the 6th of July 1699, William Kidd was taken into custody in Boston. He was locked away in Stone Prison, one of the most appalling jails in the American colonies. The awful conditions were no accident. Kidd was loaded with shackles exceeding 7.25 kilograms. He was held in isolation with insufficient food, no clean water, and no access to legal representation. Bellomont confiscated everything, and the Gardiner's Island treasure was reclaimed. Kidd's documents were grabbed too, and here is the fact that cements this entire sordid tale. The French passes, the very paperwork Kidd trusted to establish his innocence, were removed from him and dispatched to London on their own. They then vanished for more than 2 centuries. Scholars argued over the existence of the French passes. Supporters of Kidd insisted they were genuine, claiming Bellamont or the Whig lords had destroyed them to shield their own reputations. His detractors countered that the tale was fabricated. In 1911, however, an American researcher, Ralph Payne, uncovered the French passes at London's Public Record Office. They had lain there all along, incorrectly catalogued and ignored. The papers matched Kidd's description precisely. Evidence demonstrated that the Quedagh merchant voyaged under French protection. Consequently, according to the exact terms of his privateering commission, Kidd's seizure of that vessel was entirely lawful. Yet by 1911, the point was moot for William Kidd. He had been sent to England in early 1700 and spent more than a year in Newgate prison before his trial. Throughout this period, he was confined under circumstances intended to crush his spirit. His cramped, dim, and squalid cell made the ordeal worse. He couldn't consult with legal counsel in any effective way, nor could he examine his own files or build a real defense. The underlying intent was obvious. The authorities had no desire for him to present his account clearly before a judge. On 8 May 1701, when proceedings at last opened at London's Old Bailey, the courtroom was overflowing. His trial had turned into a public political drama. For the Tories, the trial offered an opportunity to humiliate the Whig peers behind the venture. For those Whig lords, the goal was to conclude the matter with the least attention possible. Kidd had to answer to 2 distinct groups of accusations. The first concerned the homicide of William Moore, the gunner he had hit with a bucket almost 4 years before. The other set comprised 5 piracy charges linked to his capture of several vessels in the Indian Ocean, among them the Quedagh merchant. Kidd's defense strategy was simple, and in an impartial setting, it might well have succeeded. Regarding the murder accusation, he contended that Moore had been a rebellious sailor who openly challenged his command. He also maintained that the act was a form of at-sea discipline, severe, yet justified under the maritime rules then in force. As for piracy, his plea was that the Quedagh merchant was operating under French protection, which made her a lawful target under his privateering letters. However, those French passes never appeared in court. They had allegedly vanished somewhere between Boston and London. Lacking those documents, Kidd possessed no written evidence that the ship had been taken legitimately. His bare claim was insufficient. And then the prosecution's witnesses stepped forward. A number of Kidd's own ex-crew members, each given a complete pardon in return for testifying, went to the witness stand and described their former commander as a merciless pirate. According to them, he had assailed innocent vessels purely for profit. These were the very men who had urged Kidd to strike, and who had threatened to rise against him if he refused. Later they had abandoned him in Madagascar and signed on with Robert Cufford's company. Now those same individuals occupied the witness stand. Shielded by their pardons and promised safety, they said precisely what the Crown wanted to hear. Kidd was forbidden from summoning witnesses himself, and had far too little time to ready his cross-examinations. The proceedings were purposely hurried so that any substantial defense became impossible. The whole trial concluded within 48 hours. The jurors took little more than 60 minutes to reach a verdict. William Kidd was convicted of the murder charge and every one of the 5 piracy counts. He was condemned to be hanged on 23 May 1701. From Newgate Prison, William Kidd was led away. Then he was escorted through London's streets to Execution Dock in Wapping, along the Thames's northern shore. That location, situated right at the water's edge, had long been the customary place for executing pirates and other seafaring offenders. The purpose was to let the condemned gaze upon the river and its vessels, the world for which they were paying the ultimate penalty. A sizable crowd had assembled to witness it. In 18th century London, public executions were a popular amusement, and Kidd's story had dominated the headlines for quite some time. Hawkers on every corner peddled pamphlets listing his alleged misdeeds, and ballad makers had already written verses about his exploits. That morning, as he walked to the gallows, the man was already turning into a legend, though he was still alive. Eyewitness accounts from that day portray Kidd as heavily intoxicated. It remains uncertain whether he was given alcohol to calm him and make him cooperative, or whether he found it on his own. Either way, He could barely remain upright, and reportedly had trouble speaking clearly when offered the chance to deliver his last words. The first attempted hanging then failed. The rope snapped, and Kidd crashed down onto the ground. In a different era, this might have been interpreted by some as a heavenly sign, suggesting the execution was unjust. But the year was 1701, and there was no mood for compassion. Kidd was brought back up to the scaffold, and a new rope was set in place. On the second attempt, it worked. After he was pronounced dead, his corpse was taken down and prepared for a final gesture of public shame. His body was smeared with tar in order to slow decay, and then locked within a specially forged iron cage known as a gibbet. This cage was afterwards suspended from a wooden pole at Tilbury Point on the Thames estuary, where it stayed for many years. Every ship coming into or leaving London would sail past the decaying body of Captain William Kidd, swaying in the wind and rain. Sailors saw it from their decks, and passengers pointed and gazed in wonder. It served as the Admiralty's equivalent of a public billboard. This is what becomes of pirates. But Kidd was not merely a warning aimed at pirates. He stood as a caution to everyone who entered into arrangements with influential men and imagined those men would stay loyal once consequences surfaced. Meanwhile, far away in Madagascar, the Adventure Galley slowly fell apart after Kidd left her stranded in the shallows near St. Mary's Island. Local scavengers carried off whatever the crew had abandoned: iron fittings, nails, and all that could be forced loose and given a new use. Eventually the masts toppled or were sliced away. The hull, already eaten through by worms, gave way beneath its own weight. As the timber softened and split, within a brief number of years the Adventure Galley had become nothing more than a dark silhouette, lying under the shallow waters of St. Mary's Harbour. Sand and mud eventually hid the remnants, while marine life took over the wreck. By the middle of the 1700s, the vessel had more or less disappeared. At least that was the belief in 2000. A team of underwater archaeologists led by Barry Clifford announced that they had come across the remains of the Adventure Galley near St. Mary's Island. The team said they had discovered cannons, hull timbers, and various artifacts typical of a warship from the late 17th century. This announcement brought tremendous excitement. The Adventure Galley was among the most celebrated missing ships in pirate history, so locating her would be a major breakthrough for archaeology. But virtually right away, doubts were raised about the identification. Other experts argued that the site Clifford pointed to could just as easily be the remains of several different vessels. It was known that various other ships had sunk in that same location during that period. St. Mary's Island functioned as a major pirate refuge, and hundreds of ships over the centuries had been deserted, deliberately sunk, or wrecked in its waters. The dispute over whether Clifford truly found the Adventure Galley persists even today. What is not disputed is that the ship rests down there somewhere in the warm, shallow waters off Madagascar. The vessel is hidden beneath 3 centuries of accumulated sediment. She had been constructed with the mission of hunting pirates. She spent her final days at a pirate haven, while the man who commanded her died at the end of a rope in London. The individuals who had sent him out on his assignment later claimed they had never heard his name. However, the story of William Kidd and the Adventure Galley is not truly a pirate narrative. Rather, it is a story about power and about the destiny of those who perform unpleasant tasks for the powerful. Among Kidd's backers were several of England's most powerful politicians. They set up the voyage to line their own pockets, leaving Kidd to shoulder every bit of the danger. Once the expedition went awry and caused political embarrassment, the same backers didn't merely cut Kidd loose. They conspired to ruin him. They concealed proof, rigged his trial, and ensured he could never publicly give his account. The French passes revealed the whole truth. These papers, showing that Kidd's most disputed seizure was lawful, were seized away from him. They lay tucked away in an official archive, undiscovered for more than 2 centuries. Kidd was executed without the single proof that could have spared him. The individuals who stripped Kidd of those papers retained their ranks, lands, and good names. Not a single one suffered repercussions for their part in the matter. The Adventure Galley itself is almost an excessively fitting symbol. It was a formidable vessel designed for one clear objective. It was dispatched into dangerous seas without proper backing, then abandoned to decay once the plan collapsed. That's not merely the tale of a vessel. It's the tale of anyone who's ever been exploited as an instrument. They were exploited by a more powerful figure and later thrown aside once they became a nuisance. Kidd wasn't a saint. The slaying of William Moore, no matter the context, was a violent act that claimed a man's life. Kidd's decision-making in the Indian Ocean was dubious, to say the least. Under stress, he took choices a far more careful commander would have shied away from. Yet the inquiry that has lingered for over 3 centuries isn't whether Kidd was virtuous. The real query is whether he was a pirate. And the proof, even the proof his own authorities withheld from the jury that condemned him, points to a much more nuanced conclusion. Those who executed him did not want people to think that way. The Adventure Galley now lies at the bottom of a Madagascar harbor. William Kidd's corpse was left in a cage at the River Thames's mouth until the flesh rotted away from his skeleton. Meanwhile, tucked inside British state records, the French passes that could have transformed everything sat forgotten for 200 years. Such is the story of Captain Kidd, less a pirate legend and more a political killing disguised as lawful punishment. It's also the story of a vessel that transported a condemned man across some 24,000 kilometers of sea. It perished in the very same harbor where his undertaking, his standing, and his existence all collapsed. If this tale resonated with you, hit subscribe. Each week, we explore the genuine accounts behind history's most notorious vessels. We delve into the commanders and journeys, those where reality is far grimier and more fascinating than the myth, and to see how a different captain was framed. Subscribe. The same sort of influential figures did it to him. That video is currently playing on your screen.